there, this is Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting in Ottawa, Canada, and you're listening to An Intelligent Look at Terrorism, a podcast about, surprise, surprise, all things terrorism related. If you've been following the news over the past few months, you've probably read where there are peace negotiations going on in Doha, which is the capital of Qatar, which is a Arab emirate on the Persian Gulf. And these peace talks are being held between the United States and Afghanistan. And they are a precursor to the Trump administration's desire to finally withdraw all U.S. troops from that country. They've been there, of course, since just after 9/11. The interesting thing about these so-called peace negotiations is that the main partner at the peace table is the Taliban, which, of course, is a terrorist group, one that sheltered Osama bin Laden throughout the 1990s. And one of the reasons why we, meaning the United States and its allies, including Canada, went into Afghanistan in the first place. So what the heck are we doing having peace talks with a terrorist group? Now, there are a lot of things surrounding this particular issue. And so I thought I would bring in an old friend of mine who also happens to be from the University of Ottawa. He's currently in Washington, D.C. right now. His name is Kamran Bokhari. He is the Director of Analytical Development at the Center for Global Policy. And he's also a senior lecturer at my institute, the Professional Development Institute, University of Ottawa. And he's going to walk us through exactly what the heck is going on. So Kamran, thank you so much for being part of the podcast.
Hey, Phil, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Okay, let's get back to a very simple question. What are these peace talks all about between the United States and primarily the Taliban? One would have thought that the Afghan government would also have a role at the table. So who are the players here and what's at stake?
So there are two components to this peace negotiation. There is the component between the United States and the Taliban. And then there's the component that's known as the intra-Afghan dialogue. And the way it's been sequenced is that there has been a preliminary deal. I think this was done way back in early spring between the Trump administration and the political representatives of the Taliban movement based in Doha, Qatar. And the agreement was that, the United States will withdraw and there would be a new power sharing understanding or agreement between the various Afghan factions, primarily between the Taliban and what we call the Afghan state, the factions that are part of the current Afghan political system. Now, the problem that we've run into is that these negotiations aren't new between the U.S. and the Taliban. It just so happens that under the Trump administration, the long shadow or the long history of the conversation that Washington and the Taliban have been having, some behind the scenes, some publicly, came to fruition. And when I say these conversations, they go back to when current Special Representative Zalmay Khalilzad was serving in the Bush administration, and there were early talks about having negotiations. Somewhere around 2003 was the first time that there was an outreach. 2 years after their regime was toppled, and that
wait, Cameron. Sorry, you're saying these talks have been going on since 2003? So 2 years after 9/11, there was already an effort to talk to the Taliban?
Yes, there was. I mean, I think that what has happened is that right after 9/11, the United States and the Bush administration had an imperative to respond to the 9/11 attacks. And at the time, as intelligence goes, we didn't know, the scope, the size, the shape of the enemy. If we had good intelligence, we probably would have been able to deter the attacks from taking place to begin with. But because of sort of the massive shock of what happened on 9/11, terrorists using planes to plow into buildings, the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and even the Capitol building housing Congress was a target, and that plane missed that target, thankfully, but a lot of lives were lost even in that plane that went down. in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. So that obviously that whole situation required a military response. And if you notice that before engaging in regime change, the United States spent a lot of time through the Pakistanis and other actors like the Saudis trying to get the Taliban to hand over Al Qaeda and its leadership, bin Laden included. And as you mentioned earlier in your introduction, not only did they house the Taliban were housing bin Laden, they refused to hand him over, and that's when
I
the United
remember
States
that. Yeah, I remember that.
that's when the United States basically went in for regime change. What I'm trying to say here is that the United States did not want to necessarily go and topple the Taliban regime because it knew it was a messy situation. It The fact that the United States was not getting what it wanted, and the realization on the part of the Bush administration at the time, that there isn't this neat divide between the Taliban and Al Qaeda, so therefore it makes sense to go and uproot this entire edifice. Now the problem is that was uprooted, but the insurgency was continuing, and at the time there were some suggestions that if you bring certain Taliban leaders into the new political process, which was called the Bonn political process, based out of the city in Germany, where there was a political agreement to create a post-Taliban regime, that you would actually have, that would take the sting out of the insurgency that had begun, pretty much because if you remember, the Taliban declined combat and they went home, and that's what guerrilla movements do, and they come back to fight another day. And so those early efforts were part of the whole thing, that if we had negotiations, then whatever insurgency would come about when the Taliban regrouped would not be as powerful, and it could be dealt with more effectively. That didn't happen. The regime that the United States created did not really take off. It had so many problems, infighting, weaknesses. And in the meantime, the Taliban insurgency kept gaining strength. So between 2003 and when the Obama administration decided to negotiate in 2009, when President Obama took office, the Taliban regime insurgency had grown in strength. And so we see negotiations, during the Obama administration. And at that time, I think there was a realization. I know my former boss, George Friedman, the founder of Stratfor, wrote a seminal piece at the time around Inauguration Day, actually shortly after inauguration, when President Obama said, hey, he's going to go and, for negotiations with the Taliban, among other sets of negotiations, like with the Iranians and so on and so forth, that it was not necessary to fight Al Qaeda. It was not necessary to fight Taliban. And I think that's the principle that has strung these talks along over these many years. Sorry for the long-winded response.
No,
To provide context.
no, it's very important. I appreciate that. Is it not problematic, though, that as you said, a variety of administrations going back to the second Bush administration have been engaged in peace talks with what everyone knows to be a terrorist group. Now, I did notice rather strangely that the Taliban is not listed by the State Department. I thought they were as a terrorist group. If you look at what's been happening over the past couple of months in Afghanistan, while these peace talks were going on in Qatar, you've had daily terrorist attacks by the Taliban in which hundreds, if not thousands, of Afghan civilians have been killed in bombings and in shootings. How does this frame the Americans' claim to talk to the Taliban when not only they are a terrorist group, but they're carrying out terrorist attacks on a daily basis in Afghanistan?
So you're absolutely right, and I agree with you, Phil, that this isn't good. If you're just asking my value judgment, this isn't good. This isn't ideal, and I wish this wasn't something we were doing. But what we want and what we can have in the world of geopolitics, that variance is massive, yet we just don't really appreciate that. And I think policymakers, those who have to pull the trigger one way or the other, have to deal with that reality. And I think that what's happening here is, and it's not just that I think, it's actually very clear that there's, for many years, there's now been sort of a bifurcation, at least an analytical bifurcation between those jihadists, those Islamist terrorists, those Islamist militants who operate within the confines of a nation state, and their political ambitions do not go beyond those boundaries, versus those who have transnational ambitions, undertake transcontinental terrorist attacks, have ambitions to topple not one government but multiple governments and redo the entire architecture. I'm talking about ISIS and Al Qaeda and groups like that. So I think that where we are right now is the realization that in order to counter the more, if you will, dangerous actor with far more dangerous ambitions, you have to counter them by doing business with those who may have the same ideas, use the same methods, but are content in gaining power within their own country. I give you an example. The last time the United States did this in a major way was to side with Stalin to get rid of Hitler.
Hmm.
And so it's the same sort of argument. No one is saying that the Taliban are not terrorists or they do not engage in terrorism. But I think what's happening here is I mean, it's not a very comfortable position to be in for any American administration, especially if your country has spent $1 trillion at least, and you have spent 19 years, fighting these same people. And we'll get into this later, but I just want to sort of highlight this is wait till this get to counterterrorism cooperation, if you will. I mean, the thought of us actually doing counterterrorism with the Taliban, just is mind-boggling to say the least.
People will be turning over in their graves for sure. I actually like the analogy you made between Stalin and Hitler. So it seems to me then, Kamran, that in the world of politics and international relations, I get it, it's a blood sport. I'm not naive. I didn't fall off the turnip truck yesterday. It almost seems that we're willing to sacrifice the interest and the safety of Afghans so long as what happens in Afghanistan doesn't spill out of its borders into the rest of the world. Is that an accurate way of looking at it then?
Sadly, yes, it is. And in fairness to to sort of really look at this in a far more nuanced way, there will be those who would argue, my job as an analyst, I have my personal preferences and I've been sharing them with you in the course of this conversation. But, I got to make sure that I keep wearing my analyst hat. And so as an analyst, when I look at this and I say, okay, so why are these people doing this? Why is the Trump administration, doing this? And so do they not care about the Afghan people? Why are they throwing them under the bus, so to speak? And I have to contend with the counter argument coming from, that school of thought that says, well, we don't have an alternative. And besides, we're not really doing a whole lot, for the Afghan people, because that's not in our control. We can't turn this place into Wisconsin, and we've been at it for such a long time. And, so then how long do we keep pumping in resources in what President Trump calls, quote, endless wars?
A fair point. Like you said, the war has been going on for the better part of 2 decades. I've seen the figures of over $1 trillion as well. It is hard to make out any progress. It seems like it's 1 step forward, 3 steps back in Afghanistan. There is the one aspect of this which I find interesting, and that is I've seen Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, and other officials downplay the current link between the Taliban and Al Qaeda. Now, of course, as we just talked about, Kamran, the Taliban housed Al Qaeda in the 1990s, of course, through 9/11, refused to give up bin Laden. Historically, they've had a very close relationship. The way that I read the open source information, I don't have access to intelligence anymore, is that there's still a fairly close relationship between the Taliban and Al Qaeda. So 2 questions then. is the U.S. administration being honest when it assesses that those links aren't important? And secondly, is this all really, when push comes to shove, is this just a way to use the peace talks to provide the veneer to justify a U.S. troop withdrawal from Afghanistan?
So I don't think it's either or. I think the reality is somewhere in between. I think that Secretary Pompeo, and his statements and those coming from other officials in the Trump administration, they basically point to a situation where they understand that there's Al Qaeda out there, but I think the understanding is that over the last 18, 19 years, Al Qaeda has been decimated sufficiently to where uh, we don't need to be present in country the way we have in order to be able to keep it, keep the lid on Al Qaeda.
Okay.
Uh, and so I think there's that aspect. The other thing is that, as you know, ISIS has eclipsed Al Qaeda. So
Mm-hmm.
there is a bigger threat here. And I mean, it's very obvious that the way that the United States, after leaving Iraq, had to go back into Iraq. Our country, Canada, had to put forces in Iraq. We had, the operations in Syria as well. And so to basically go after ISIS. So I think here in Afghanistan, I think those two sort of concerns converge, and they say, okay, you know what? Look, we keep forces, and they're in the background. They're about like 7,000 troops, roughly around that number right now. And then the heavy lifting is being done, or at least or the effort is being made to do the heavy lifting by the Afghan forces.
Right.
That's not going to work in the long haul. That's not sufficient because we can't be there ad infinitum,
Mm-hmm.
and they haven't demonstrated the ability to sort of fly solo, if you will.
Right.
There are limits. So, and if this situation continues, ISIS is going to keep growing. And I remember a couple of years ago, we had that massive ordnance penetrator bomb, the Moab,
Yes.
dropped
Yes.
on ISIS headquarters in Nangarhar province, and we did some considerable damage to ISIS. But look, these are it's like mowing the lawn until the next time, and this grass is going to grow. So I think from the Trump administration's point of view, and this is something that they didn't come up with, this is what the Obama guys were also thinking, is that if we stop the war, if we contain the war in Afghanistan, and we get the Taliban to go and be the policemen, or at least have a power sharing arrangement where they are also part of this effort to make sure there are no actors in this country using it as a springboard to launch attacks against other countries, then that could be called a bargain. Now, I want to point out that, and it isn't discussed in that depth, or people have forgotten about it, that in 2007, with at the height of the Al Qaeda in Iraq insurgency, the bombings, the daily multiple bombings against Shiites and U.S. forces, it was a very bad time, and the Bush administration was seen as not in control of the situation. That's when General David Petraeus, who was the commander of the U.S. forces, engaged in something that was out of the box. He basically negotiated with those Sunni political principles who were siding with Al Qaeda in Iraq at the time, ISIS's predecessor,
Mm-hmm.
and said, "Can we take these tribal people off off the battle space? Can we take them off the battlefield? And because these are indigenous elements within Iraq that are not going away anywhere. But if we can drive a wedge between them and the foreign fighters around Zarqawi and his followers, who are, they were foreign fighters, and then if we can address their political needs and bring them into the political system that's currently dominated by the Shiites and the Kurds, then we can really better manage. AQ in Iraq becomes far more manageable in terms of an entity. That principle is the same. It's the same principle that we're dealing with in Afghanistan.
Okay. I get a lot of what you're saying. And as I said, I fully understand the frustration that not just the Trump administration, but the Obama administration, the Bush administration felt about this never ending war that was going on in Afghanistan. So the desire to withdraw makes a lot of sense to me. And yeah, sure, maybe the Taliban will agree in principle that we won't allow Afghan territory to be used by terrorist groups to strike abroad. So what happens if 6 months later the Taliban say, "Hey, guess what? We were just kidding. We had our fingers crossed behind our back." Do we see another situation where the Taliban are essentially creating a terrorism central and something happens internationally and then it draws in the international actors again? Is that a potential scenario?
It is possible. Look, you can't trust them, and I'll tell you why. It's not just because of their ideology. I don't know, if you follow my work that diligently. My school of thought has sort of moved from ideology, heavy, to tradecraft and interests of actors as well. And I look at all actors based on how their behavior as a function of how they see their interests. So I think that the Taliban can't be trusted because of where they are at this moment and what their needs will be, assuming these peace talks do not succeed. And I want to say and be on record to say that I would be really surprised that if in the short term we actually had a peace agreement that sticks, that we actually come out of these negotiations with a solution that's for real and not just sort of signing off, and then when America goes home they take out their knives and guns and start fighting again. So in that scenario, I'm assuming that this isn't going to work. In that scenario, the Taliban will then want to be able to use their military advantage on the battle space to overwhelm their opponents. Uh, and when that happens, they're going to need a lot of force multiplier, effect, as to the extent that they can get. Who's going to give that? That's going to come from all these foreign fighters that are there, and so they don't. We can't trust that they will actually keep these guys under lock and key. Nobody does anything for free. So if these guys fight for them, then they want to be able to do their own thing. Look,
Mm-hmm.
this is what the Taliban were doing in the 90s.
Right.
Al Qaeda fighters were helping the Taliban on the battle space in exchange for having a territory and being left to do what they wanted to do, which was the 9/11 attacks.
Right.
And if you remember, a prominent anti-Taliban commander, Ahmad Shah Massoud, was
Mm-hmm.
assassinated by Al Qaeda operatives posing as journalists and cameramen, uh,
On the eve of 9/11.
on the eve of 9/11. So
Yeah.
we can't trust these people because their needs are as such. The other thing is that uh, they they have ISIS on their tail now. ISIS is saying, its message is, if you've believed in the Taliban, they've betrayed the cause, the jihadist cause, and so you need to join us. And there are a lot of people within the Taliban rank that are looking at this and saying, is this true? And they're having second thoughts. And the more radicalized elements, the people, and not even just the more radicalized, the people who don't know anything but fighting, and
Mm-hmm.
they're going to go and join ISIS. So, what does that mean? It means the Taliban have to be able to uphold their, if you will, radical credentials, and they're going to do things that will violate, will not be at least in the spirit of the agreement. And so, because of who the Taliban are, what their interests are, they cannot be trusted.
Wow. I can't say you're painting an optimistic scenario. Kamran, the other thing, of course, is that we can't ignore the Afghan people. They're the ones that have suffered the most over the past 20 years. If this peace deal goes through and the United States withdraws most of its forces from Afghanistan, let's assume the Taliban will in effect become the government of Afghanistan. What does this mean for the Afghan people? I've seen statements by Taliban leaders. Oh yeah, we're going to respect women's rights. Oh yeah, we're going to let girls go to school. Oh yeah, we're nice people. At the end of the day, can this possibly be at all a good news story for the Afghan people?
So it could be. We live in the hope. But that means that those opposed to the Taliban, the anti-Taliban camp, has a lot of power. There's more equity in this, power sharing agreement that we're trying to put together. But we know that that's not going to happen. And the other thing that we have to be worried about is that uh, the current Taliban leadership have had a long time to sort of do what they call political learning, and that doesn't mean that they have reformed. I'm actually saying that they how to do what they do in a far more sophisticated way. So they're telling us what we want to hear. They're telling us, oh, don't worry about it, we're all for women's education. That was a mistake what we did in the 90s, and we've learned from it. We're not that, don't judge us. And we're all for women employment and whatnot. They're telling us what we want to hear. In the intel business that you're very familiar with, it's called info ops.
Mm-hmm.
And psyops. They're playing games with us, and they're telling us what we want to hear. They're giving us what we need to hear to sort of keep rolling that ball forward in terms of the whole political process. So they're going to suppress. So we're not going to see like blatant, if you will, acts of violence where people's hands are being cut off, women are being attacked, and people are being whipped in stadiums, and the things like the destruction of the Buddhas of Bamiyan that they did back in the 90s. They're going to do this in a very political, legalistic way, and they're going to enshrine this. What I'm saying is that the only scenario that I see this peace process succeed is that at the end of it, at the end of that rainbow, we get a state that looks like the Islamic Republic of Iran, only that it's going to be in Afghanistan. It's going to be a Sunni version. So that's what we're looking at, and that is far more dangerous because there's going to be systematic, if you will, suppression of women, of minorities, of anybody who disagrees with the Taliban ideology. So they're not going to be crude with their methods, and that makes them far more dangerous.
Wow. I must say, Cameron, I've known you for a great many years and I have a great deal of respect for your scholarship, but I cannot recall having hosted a guest on my podcast that has left me more pessimistic than you
I'm
have
sorry
today.
to do that. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but
Well,
that's what worries us.
well, it's a realist. One last question, Cameron. Let's assume that Joe Biden wins the election in a little more than a month's time. Do you see any major change of direction under a Democratic White House versus the Trump administration?
So, look, there's not going to be a course reversal because this is the course that, as I said, isn't something that Trump came up with. It's a gradual progression from the Bush administration years. And so, what we will see is, a readjustment, if you will, of the whole process, because that's what new administrations do. Um, if you to make a point of comparison, it's not that Trump is would make a better would make war against Iran when he nixed the nuclear deal. He just wanted a deal that was better from his point of view and something that he could own as opposed to just inherit. So apply that to a future Biden administration and the Afghan political process. So they just can't sort of say, okay, you know what? If you want to put a big burqa over this country, we're fine with it. Just make sure AQ and ISIS is under lock and key. The Biden administration will be under pressure from its constituents that are minorities, that are women, that are far more sensitive to human rights, and therefore his administration is going to have a tougher time extracting concessions from the Taliban, because at the end of the day, look, in principle, everything is negotiated in the back channels. The core deal is done. That look, we're going to withdraw, and we're going to recognize you and do business with you. You're going to get off the terrorist list if you are on there, and we'll remove sanctions and we'll treat you like normal, the whole diplomatic courtesy and international legitimacy. That's already done. The question is, in what shape or form, and how do you sell it to the world, and the details. And I think that's where we're going to see a difference in the way the Biden administration deals with this. And then, of course, there's the ongoing debate in the policy world amongst policy experts that is this nationalist versus transnational jihadist bifurcation real, and to what extent, or is it just an analytical category that we came up with to make sense of ground realities that are so fuzzy?
I've always said we have to be very, very careful with drawing categories around terrorism because A, it's so fluid and it does change quite a bit, and we tend to be sort of stubborn in trying to maintain things that are no longer applicable. Bottom line, I guess, Kamran, is that we're going to have to watch this space and see what happens with the negotiations. We'll see what happens after November, the November 4th elections, and where it goes. I want to thank you for taking the time. I've known you, like I said, for a great deal of time, and I always have a great deal of respect for your views on things. And you've given us some really interesting insight into not just these negotiations with the Taliban, but the Taliban support for terrorism, what the Taliban are doing in Afghanistan. And I think my listeners will agree that we're a lot better informed today because you took the time to talk. Much appreciated, Kamran.
Thank you so much. And really, it was a pleasure to be on your show.
So that was my conversation with Kamran Bokhari. I'm curious what you think. Have you any experience? Do you have any views on peace talks with the Taliban? You can reach me on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com, or on Twitter @BorealisSaves. You'll also find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook. If you want to subscribe to all the content from Borealis, go to my website, borealisrisk.com, hit the subscribe button, and if you provide me with your email, you get a free daily digest every day of all the content. I'd love to hear from you. We'll talk again soon. Until then, stay safe.